After the adoption of agriculture, humans began to transform the societies around their settlements in order to better suit their needs. As we can see in this artist's reconstruction of one of the lost cities of the Amazon, that's from the Scientific American article by Michael Heckenberg, you can see not just the settlement where people have cleared the forest, building a wall around their community, but also the lands surrounding their communities have been cleared of the forests in order to plant crops. You see different types of crops, fields that are in different stages of either being cultivated or being left fallow, which means to let it alone, not being cultivated to allow it to regenerate the new soil nutrients. And we also see what looks like forest, but is actually a managed forest, where they have removed selectively different tree species, leaving behind other ones that were more useful, ones that bear fruits that are edible. After the development of agriculture, human societies began to shape the environment on a large scale in order to better suit their needs. Hunter-gatherer societies also manipulated their environments, but on a much smaller scale. Hunter-gatherers commonly used fire in order to discourage certain shrubs and encourage the growth of seed-bearing grasses, or to assist in hunting. The primary impact of these environmental transformations was clearing land for agriculture. And when you clear the land of its natural plant growth in order to put in agricultural crops, there's an overall reduction in the diversity of the ecosystem. There are many more species of plants that are growing in a native environment than there are that are growing in an agricultural field, which may have a single crop grown within it. These impacts from land clearing grew proportional to the increases in the human population. Here in the Southwest, the rule of thumb is that it required at least 2.5 acres per person in order to meet their subsistence needs. So for a family of 4, that would be 10 acres around their house that they would have to transform for their use to be cultivated. But it's not just the lands that are under active cultivation. There would have to be other lands that have been transformed earlier or will be transformed later, because soils lose their nutrients after repeated cultivation, and you have to go through a cycle of letting some lands lie fallow, unused, in order to allow them to regenerate nutrients. And you go through a cycle of moving from one field to another, and leaving the previous ones fallow for some period of years before you rotate back to them. So there's more than just the 2.5 acres per person, perhaps, that's been transformed, but there are maybe 10 more acres per person that have been transformed in the past and are going through various cycles of fallow recovery. These fallow fields may still be useful because often invasive weeds that move into these areas are ones that produce seeds that can be useful. Or if you have domesticated animals like llamas and alpacas, you can allow them to graze in those fallowed areas, and they'll also provide the additional benefit of providing some fertilizer in the dung that they leave behind. So what are some ways that people modify their environment to make it more suitable for agriculture, in addition to just simply clearing the native vegetation? Some of the examples that we will look at include irrigation and terracing. As I mentioned, many hunter-gatherers often used fire as a means of manipulating the landscape to better suit their needs, burning away certain shrub species to encourage the growth of various grasses that provided seeds that were edible, or sometimes to assist in hunting. Here, some Australian Aborigines are doing both, burning away brush that allows certain grasses that provide edible seeds to grow, but also assisting them in the hunting of goanna, what we call monitor lizards. These are 3 to 4 foot long lizards that live in burrows, and when the fires burn towards them, they rush down into their burrows, but as the fire burns over the burrow, it removes all the oxygen, suffocating the animal within, making it a lot easier to capture. Increasing frequency of wildfire in some areas after 12,000 BC has been suggested as evidence of human hunter-gatherers moving into the North American continent. But the transformations by fire on a small scale by hunter-gatherers are dwarfed by the later transformations by land clearing by later agricultural people. You should have already read the article by Michael Heckenberg, Lost Cities of the Amazon, from Scientific American, and also viewed the video, the episode of the History Channel series Digging for the Truth, also called Lost Cities of the Amazon. So you should have some familiarity of this concept of the anthropogenic Amazon, that the Amazon is not a pristine, unaltered rainforest, but for thousands of years it has been manipulated by human populations, transforming it to better suit their needs. In the video, not only do we see archaeological evidence of this, but you also visit a contemporary Amazonian Indian community and see how they manage and manipulate the landscape in order to extract resources for their consumption. Archaeologist Michael Heckenberger has used some very interesting methods in order to identify prehistoric sites in the Amazon. As you can imagine, it is a huge area and it is very difficult to identify sites on foot, given the nature of the growth in the jungles. So Heckenberger uses satellite imagery. And here is a map that he has used geographic information systems to create based upon composite satellite imagery, showing clusters of communities, the lands around them that have been transformed, and the causeways or roads that actually connect these communities. On the right, there is an artist's reconstruction of one of these villages, the same one that we saw on the opening slide, but it identifies some of the features that people have built. Various dwellings, the plaza in the center of the community, the log palisade or wall that surrounds it, gardens of different types surrounding the community, orchards, managed forest. Large agricultural communities formerly lived in the Amazon and greatly transformed it in order to meet their needs. Heckenberger uses satellite imagery in order to identify prehistoric features. In this satellite image, it is in the ultraviolet spectrum. Different plants reflect light in different ways, and it allows us to identify different patterns of vegetation that may have been altered by human transformation of the environment. You can see how the areas that were settled by people have a different and distinct color than the areas that surround them. You can match up the detailed satellite image on the right with the map where it is down in the lower center. You can see site X11 on the map and site X11 here on the satellite image. While the previous satellite image used the ultraviolet spectrum, this image uses the infrared spectrum. And we can identify dark lines that indicate ditches and earthworks that surround different villages, as well as lines that connect these villages. And these are remnants of roadways, some of them causeways that elevated them above the floodplain so they would remain dry during the wet season. And again, we can match this satellite image with the map on the left. It's in the upper left-hand corner of the map. Here is site X6 in the satellite image. Here is site X6 in the map. Amazonian dark earth is a really amazing transformation of the environment that's discussed in both the reading and the video. Rainforest soils are notoriously poor in nutrients because of all the rain that falls and then percolates through the soils, leaching the nutrients out. Amazonian dark earth is soil that is extremely rich in nutrients, and it was created by past human activities, especially the deliberate dumping of organic trash and low-intensity burning in order to add charcoal and other nutrients into the soils. In the photo above, you can see excavations down into soils, giving us a profile of the soils and the different layers of the soils. And the unmodified soils, you can see, are relatively red towards the top because of oxidation of the iron in the soils. But as you get lower, they turn yellow because all of the iron and also the organic materials are being leached out and removed by the waters that are percolating through. In contrast, the anthropogenic soils, those that have been created by human activity, are extremely dark, and this is because of the high levels of organic materials that provide nutrients for plants that people will be growing in these fields. In some parts of the Amazon basin and in other parts of South America, a practice called raised bed agriculture was used to contend with the seasonal flooding that comes with the cycles of wet seasons and dry seasons. These periods of flooding would present challenges to agriculture as large areas were inundated along the floodplains of rivers. Raised planting beds of soils were constructed in order to elevate the fields above the levels of these seasonal floods. And these are found in many areas, in the Amazon basin, in coastal plains, and even in highland valleys. One of these highland valleys is the Titicaca Basin on the border between Peru and Bolivia, and this is an extremely high elevation region. It is a basin within the Andes, and there is no drainage out of the basin. In adjacent mountains, the water and rain and snow and the melt from the snow that falls there all flows down into the basin and has no outlet to the sea. There's a large lake in the basin, but during the wet season, much of the basin is inundated with shallow water. Now note behind the homesteads in the foreground there's a pattern of linear ridges. During the wet season, the tops of these linear ridges protrude up above the floodwaters and would have allowed cultivation of crops. Now these are a prehistoric system that has fallen into disuse, but when they were in use, the tops of all of those would have been several inches to maybe a foot or more above the level of the floodwaters, and provide a dry surface into which you could plant your crops. But they would also be sub-irrigated because of water percolating in from the sort of canals that run between the ridges. The soils within the ridge would have lots of water available, and the roots of the plants could tap down into the groundwater. In the Titicaca Basin, these were really carefully constructed features that were 6 to 12 meters wide and 100 to 200 meters long, with canals in between with water within them. They have layers of cobbles underneath, and then gravels, then clays and soils, and it allows stability of the feature as well as a permeable substrate that water can infiltrate through and allow the roots to penetrate down into and have direct access to this groundwater. The fields on top would be periodically enriched by cleaning the canals out and removing organic materials that had built up in the bottom of the canals. And the canals acted as a heat sink during the day. The Titicaca Basin is at an elevation of 10,000 feet. It has a very short growing season. But the canals absorb heat during the day and then release it during the night. And studies have shown that this release of heat from these canals actually increases the length of the growing season by 7 to 10 days. And that 7 to 10 days can be really key to success and failure, or high productivity or low productivity in this very high elevation environment. Because spring frosts can destroy early emerging plants, and also fall frosts could also destroy plants before you harvest the crops. Experiments by archaeologists working with indigenous farmers have found that rebuilding some of these raised fields increased the productivity of the land 4 to 7-fold over cultivation without using the raised fields. Raised fields were found in lowland environments as well. Here is along a river in Colombia. Linear raised fields extend perpendicularly from the banks of the river along the floodplain. So the length of these ridges corresponds to the area that will be underwater during the wet season and the river's flooding. And it allows people to have extensive areas under cultivation even during the flood season. Unfortunately, this image doesn't have a scale in it, but you can see some individual large trees to give you some suggestion of the size. And this is on a wide landscape basis. You can also see how aerial photos and satellite imagery is absolutely essential to really appreciate the landscape level of transformation in the environments that has been done by these prehistoric societies. The Llanos de Mochos region in Bolivia is in the upper headwaters of the Amazon River and is right at the foot of the Andes Mountains. Llanos means plains in Spanish and is a flat region, and is the plains of the Mochos, an indigenous people that inhabited this area at the time of Spanish contact. This area has a wet season that lasts from December to May, when there's extensive flooding of the flat floodplains along the rivers, and then a dry season from June to November, when the plains dry up and water becomes extremely limited except for in the main rivers. Archaeologist Clark Erickson of the University of Pennsylvania has spent nearly 30 years studying this pre-Hispanic managed landscape on the Llanos de Mochos. He's found that there are a variety of ways that people manipulated the landscape in order to manage the resources for the consumption, and particularly how to manage the water. This overview shows an area of extensive raised fields on the Llanos de Mochos. Erickson's research has shown that hundreds of thousands of acres in the Llanos de Mochos have been manipulated in this way, transformed in order to allow extremely productive agriculture. These raised fields were used to cultivate both manioc and corn. Most of the Llanos de Mochos is a flat plain that's covered with grasses and a few isolated shrubs and trees. Where you have these sorts of forest islands, they are literally islands that are elevated above the floodplains because they are the remnants of artificial mounds that once supported settlements, and they still have trees that grow upon them that don't grow upon the adjacent low-lying lands that are seasonally inundated. Here we see a larger forest island, and within it you can see evidence of fortifications, a ringed ditch. So you see this circle here in the center. There is a ditch that was excavated there, and then on the interior of the ditch the soil was piled up to create a berm that would support a wooden palisade or wall. But down in the ditch, which collects more water, you have taller trees growing, allowing us to identify these features. The presence of these fortifications indicates the existence of conflict between some of the communities. Raised roadbeds or causeways connected settlements along the Llano, and they allowed people to continue foot travel through these regions even during the wet season when the adjacent areas were flooded. And you can also see in the left-hand image how raised fields are adjacent to the causeways and could have been accessed along them. But the prehistoric residents of the Llanos de Mochos didn't just manipulate the landscape for agricultural production, they managed the water and they managed fisheries. Fish weirs are structures that control the movements of fish that follow the floodwaters. As the floodwaters expanded over the floodplains, fish would follow along, moving into those environments where they could forage. And many fish breed at this time of year in those shallow waters. And then as the waters recede, they would return to the main channel of the rivers. But if people had built weirs which restrict their movements, that only have openings in certain places, gates, and at those gates you can place baskets that are designed as traps. So you can trap all the fish that are trying to move. But they also built ponds that would collect water, and instead of the fish moving from the floodplains out into the main channel, if they were able to avoid the weirs, they could move into these ponds, where then they could be caught easily later in the dry season, extending the availability of these fisheries. Not all transformations of the landscape were done on the same scale as those huge raised beds that are 10 to 12 meters across and 100 and 200 meters long. Some were done on a smaller scale of the construction, but still done on a wide scale across the landscape. On the left you see a aerial image overviewing a field in the French Guianas, which has been transformed by building small mounds. Each of those mounds is maybe a meter to 1.5 meters across. The mounds remain above the seasonal floods, allowing people to plant crops in them, but research has shown another really interesting factor that makes these even more productive. They become refuges for various small animals that are also trying to escape the flood waters. Worms and worm castings enrich the soils, and ants whose tunneling aerates and mix the soils. So this creates a little microenvironment that not only is better for growing crops, but attracts certain animals that continue to modify the soils and make them even more productive. Another area where mounding was also done was across the northern ranges of corn's cultivation. Here are some agricultural mounds in a field on the University of Wisconsin campus. Now it's probably underneath a dormitory. But flooding wasn't a problem here, so why create mounds for planting? And the clue is the white stuff that's between the dark mounds. That's snow. But because the soils within the mounds maintain their heat better, the snows have melted earlier, and these low mounds would have been less susceptible to frosts. And this sort of mounding is used at the northern extent of corn's cultivation, in Wisconsin, through the Great Lakes, in southern Canada, and the northeastern part of the United States, places where growing seasons were short, and any small thing that you could do to slightly extend that growing season, the use of these mounds to create suitable little microenvironments with slightly higher temperatures, would help with agricultural success and increased productivity. Irrigation is the diversion of water from a stream or river to agricultural fields via a canal. But you need a variety of structures in addition to just your primary canal. You need a diversion dam or weir in order to divert water from the stream or river into your canal. You need a head gate and other gates along the canal to close off flow or open up flow. And in addition to the primary canal, you need secondary delivery canals, which will take the water out to the fields. And then the fields themselves have to be prepared, leveled relatively flat, and then berms surrounding them to contain the irrigation water, so the water doesn't just flow out and beyond the fields, irrigating areas that you don't have under cultivation. Now, irrigation systems require continuous maintenance and supervision. These are earthen irrigation systems. They don't have canals that are lined with concrete the way that we have today here in the Phoenix region. And as water flows through these earthen canals, it is eroding it in some areas and depositing it in other areas. So you need to continuously maintain these and supervise them to assure that you don't have any breaches of the canals and loss of water. The adoption of irrigation required the development of new social institutions in order to organize the labor needed for construction and maintenance, and also to allocate the water from the canals among the various users along the canals. Irrigation is often found in arid regions and allowed many arid regions to actually practice highly productive agriculture because of their ability to divert water into their fields. And it's found in places like coastal Peru, highland Mesoamerica, and here in the American Southwest. Irrigation increases agricultural productivity in these arid environments, but it also creates dependency and vulnerability, a concept that we'll explore when we look at the Hohokam of the American Southwest, who had extensive irrigation systems here in the Phoenix Basin, south along the Gila River, down in the Tucson area, along the Verde River to the north, and along the Gila near Safford to the east. This is an overview of a diversion weir on a traditional irrigation system along the Rio Sonora in the state of Sonora in northern Mexico. The stream flows this direction from the left side to the right side, and the weir is this sort of fence-like structure that diverts the water from the main flow into the canal. The head of the canal is where the two horses are drinking, and then the canal extends further off the screen to deliver water to agricultural fields. Later we will look at the irrigation systems of the Hohokam, and they had very large irrigation systems here in the greater Phoenix area. Here we have an overview of the Phoenix area. The airport is right here. Downtown Phoenix is here. Mesa Community College campus is about here. You can see that these irrigation systems delivered water great distances from the Salt River. The longest starts here near Papago Butte and extends along the north side of the river, off the screen for a little bit, down here, and then would continue further 16 miles out towards Glendale, beginning east of the airport and ending out in Glendale. These canals were all dug by hand and irrigated tens of thousands of acres in the Phoenix area. Lands that were formerly of little value and had low productivity, lower Sonoran ecosystems with creosote bush and bursage, could now be cultivated and used to grow corn, beans, squash, and perhaps most importantly, cotton. This is the intake of a prehistoric canal on the north side of the Salt River. This is part of the Scottsdale Canal system that diverted water from the Salt River on its north side and then irrigated much of what is now the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community in South Scottsdale. You can see that these are very large constructions. The gentleman is standing down at the bottom, and it is deeper than he is tall. Excavated canals show that the largest canals, and they are largest near where they take the water out of the river, were up to 50 feet wide and 15 feet deep. Here is another view of a segment along that canal system. Canal System 6, or the Scottsdale system, was well studied when Highway 87 was widened through that area, and some of the canal was excavated, and some settlements along it were also excavated prior to the construction of the road. When they excavate a canal, you dig the soils out and then pile up the material on either side. The water within the canal, the height of the water is near the top of these berms that you have piled up on either side of the ditch that you've excavated. Therefore, the water within the canal, its height, its elevation, is above that of the adjacent lands that you want to irrigate, because water only flows downhill. And prehistoric peoples didn't have systems of pumps in order to move water uphill. Another way that the landscape was modified in order to make it more productive for human agriculture is terracing, which allows the use of steep slopes without increased erosion and soil loss. And it also creates a tremendous increase in the amount of productive agricultural lands in steep areas. So this is an overview of a valley in Peru, and you can see down in the bottom of the valley where there are agricultural lands along the drainage in the bottom of the valley. But the steep slopes, if you did not terrace them, once you started disturbing those soils, they would easily wash away, leaving denuded bare rock and nothing to grow on that slope. So terraces create a series of check dams that prevent erosion, and they also create a series of level plots that can be cultivated. They were widely used in the Andes in particular, but also in Mesoamerica and here in the American Southwest. In the Andes, these were directed constructions by the state in order to increase the productivity of different regions, in order to increase the amount of materials that could be taxed by the state. And in the Andes, you have whole valleys that have been fully transformed through terracing in order to increase the ability to cultivate the lands. We're going to end looking at some examples of large-scale modifications of the landscape for agricultural use here in the American Southwest. And these include areas that we kind of think of as wilderness and unmodified desert. Areas like Agua Fria National Monument, which is north of Phoenix along I-17 if you were driving towards Flagstaff. Much of the landscape on top of Perry Mesa was modified by prehistoric farmers who immigrated to this area from areas to the north and northwest in the 12 and 1300s, and then abandoned the area in the 1400s, retreating back north, likely joining growing communities on the Hopi Mesas and at Zuni. Perry Mesa is a volcanic feature, and much of the surface is volcanic lava with pockets of soils in between. And people would clear the rocks in order to expose larger areas of soil, and then the rocks would be arranged into alignments that were built parallel to the slope to prevent erosion, to slow down the runoff from rains, and build up soils behind them that would have elevated organic content. Archaeologists, biologists, and soil scientists from Arizona State University conducted a multi-year interdisciplinary research project on Perry Mesa called Legacies on the Landscape, and I provided some links to some of their research that is available on the web. This map shows one of the sites that was recorded by ASU archaeologists on Perry Mesa, and you can see this area with many rock alignments where they had moved rocks in order to expose soils, arranged them parallel to the slope in order to slow down runoff and build up soils behind them. You can also see a habitation site nearby. Here we can see some terraces on a steep slope that were built in order to slow down the movement of water and to catch soils behind them. We also see relics of the plants that were planted on some of these terraces, agave and prickly pear. Much of the agave on Perry Mesa has been shown by botanists working at the Desert Botanical Gardens to be derived from northern Mexican domesticated varieties of agave that were introduced to the U.S. Southwest after AD 1100. People also encouraged the growth of plants like prickly pear, and prickly pear is really easy to segment and replant. If you cut off a section of a prickly pear, it will want to try to send out roots and reestablish itself, so it can very easily be propagated. The soils associated with terraces and rock alignments not only have more organic material within them, they also have different soil textures than adjacent areas without terraces. Because of the terraces, the soils in the agricultural fields changed over time. The resulting soils that have been altered by human activity have better water retention capacity and more nutrients, and this would have improved chances for agricultural success. And these benefits continue into the present, as the biologists working with the archaeologists were able to demonstrate that there is a greater diversity of plant species growing within areas with terraces and rock alignments than in adjacent areas that had not been altered by human modification of the landscape. This graph shows the percentages of the soils that are made of clay, silt, and sand. And if you get towards the middle, those are called loams, and loams have a better moisture retention capacity than pure clay, pure silt, or pure sand. And the open circles represents the terrace soils, whereas the dark circles are the control soils, soils that were sampled from areas that had not been manipulated by human activity. And you can see that many of the soil samples taken from the terraces are in the loam area, whereas almost all of the samples taken from the control areas are more clay, which would have had less soil moisture retention and also would not allow penetration of roots as easily. In addition to arranging rows of rocks in parallel with the slope to create terraces, check dams, and rock alignments, in some cases gridded fields were created, with grids of rocks creating cells within that would trap and hold the rainwater and increase the moisture within each of the cells. And here we see an area of gridded fields along the Gila River near Pima, Arizona. Now this is near the river. It's in the foothills above the river. It's an area that you could not deliver water to from an irrigation canal. Rather, this was dry farmed, and they were trying to increase the ability of the soils to catch and retain moisture. In the lower foreground, you can see another system of gridded fields near Safford, Arizona. And here we have shallow soils that were covered by a layer of rocks and gravel. And so before you could plant, you had to move these rocks and gravels. So the larger rocks are moved in order to help expose the soils and allow you to use your digging sticks to create holes to plant your seeds in. The gravels are retained within the cells in order to act as a mulch to conserve the moisture in the soils beneath. Now, these were used for dry land cultivation, primarily of agave, a crop which they would not need to supplement the availability of water, but doing anything to increase the availability of water would increase the productivity of agave cultivation. So they used the terraced foothills adjacent to the floodplain for this dry land cultivation of agave, modifying that landscape by building these gridded alignments, and they also used the floodplain, modifying it by building canals and fields, and it was irrigated much as it is today. So what to remember? After the advent of agriculture, human societies began to shape their environments on large scales, on a landscape scale, in order to better suit their needs for agriculture. Even areas that we now consider wilderness, like the rainforests of the Amazon and desert grasslands in Arizona's Agua Fria National Monument, have been shaped by past human activities, and some of these past efforts continue to affect those local environments even today, like the Amazonian dark earth and the better soils that are found associated with prehistoric fields on top of Perry Mesa and Agua Fria National Monument.